You're sitting in a seat you paid for in full. VIP cabin. Quiet, private. Then a flight attendant approaches and says very politely, "Excuse me, could you please switch seats with another passenger? Not for safety reasons, not because of a technical malfunction. Simply because it will be more convenient for everyone." What will you do? Would you stand up, give up your seat, and let things go smoothly? Or would you stay accepting the disapproving stares, the silence of the crowd, and the risk of being seen as a troublemaker? The woman in this story chose to stay. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resist. She simply said calmly, "This is my place." What nobody knew was that she was the CEO of that airline. But this story isn't about titles. It's about a very old, very painful question. Why is it that in so many situations people always choose you to be the one to give way? If you've ever stayed silent to make things easier, if you've ever stood up against your will, then this story is for you. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us in exploring this story. A quiet one, but one that might make you reflect on yourself. Mornings at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport always have a very unique rhythm. Not as hectic as New York, nor as leisurely as smaller Midwestern airports. Here, everything moves continuously steadily, as if everyone knows where they're going, but no one really has time to take a good look at the people around them. Amara Lewis sat quietly in the cream-colored leather chair seat 1A by the window. She had been there for almost 10 minutes. Outside the small, oval-shaped window, the morning sunlight slanted across the aircraft, reflecting a pale silver hue. Baggage carts moved past, leaving a low rhythmic sound trail on the tarmac. The atmosphere in first class was quiet, almost solemn. Amara neatly placed her handbag under the seat in front of her. A dark brown leather bag, unbranded, unpretentious. It looked like something a middle-aged woman would carry on a short business trip. No one could guess its value, and Amara never intended for anyone to guess. She exhaled slowly. This is a normal domestic flight. Atlanta to San Francisco. About 5 hours weather permitting. Amara had flown this route countless times in her life. There were times when she knew every corner of the airport, every coffee shop, every corridor leading to the departure gate by heart. But this morning she felt a little different. Not exactly worried. Not nervous either. It was a more familiar feeling, a feeling difficult to name, but if she had to express it, Amara would say it was a quiet vigilance. She opened the thin notebook resting on her lap. Not a laptop, not a tablet, just a simple paper notebook with a gray cover and a few neat lines written in blue ink. Amara had maintained this habit for years, since, before she had her own office, a secretary, or those hours-long meetings with the board of directors. Handwriting helps her think more slowly and more clearly. Around them, other passengers in first class began settling into their seats. A white man in his late 60s wearing a light gray suit was speaking softly to a flight attendant about the type of beverage he wanted after takeoff. A younger couple sat across the aisle, chuckling softly as they looked at something on their phones. Amara observed everything with a calm gaze. She learned early on that observing without judgment is a survival skill, especially for a black woman growing up in environments where she constantly questioned whether she was truly welcome. A flight attendant approached. She was in her mid-30s, her blonde hair neatly tied back her uniform, impeccable, and her smile practiced. Her name tag read Emily Carter. Emily stopped right next to Amara's seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice polite but slightly tense. "Could you please show me your boarding pass?" The question fell into the quiet space like a small pebble. Amara looked up. In that very brief moment, many things flashed through her mind. Not how to answer the question, but why the question was asked. She had seen Emily greet other passengers. She had seen the smiles, the friendly glances, the natural-sounding welcome aboard. And she had also noticed that no one else was asked to show their boarding pass after they had taken their seats. Amara's expression remained unchanged. "Of course," she replied, her voice even neither high nor low. She opened her bag, took out her boarding pass, and handed it to Emily. Not hurried, not slow. Her movements were like someone who had done this hundreds of times and didn't consider it a problem. Emily held the card, bending down to examine it closely. Too closely. She checked the name, checked the seat number, looked up at Amara, then looked down at the card again. Amara recognized something very familiar. It wasn't a mistake, nor was it a professional error. That is suspicion. It's a very subtle, very veiled form of doubt, very difficult to name unless one has experienced it many times. But Amara has lived with that feeling almost her entire life. She remembered the first time she walked into a high-end store in Chicago when she was a middle manager. She remembered the sales clerk's gaze scrutinizing her from head to toe, then discreetly following behind her. She remembered the meetings where she had to speak twice as much, twice as clearly, only to be heard half as much. Emily returned the boarding pass. "Thank you," she said. "Have a pleasant flight." There was no apology. There was no explanation. Emily turned away. Amara watched her back for a few seconds, then bent down to the notebook on her lap. She wrote a short line. 064, 7 a.m. Seat 1A. Boarding pass check after seating. That's all. It wasn't because Amara wanted to cause trouble. Nor was it because she was looking for a confrontation. Because deep down Amara understood one thing very clearly: small moments like these, if not captured, would simply vanish as if they never existed. She closed the notebook and placed it neatly on her lap. The plane's doors weren't closed yet. The announcement blared again. The last passengers were boarding. Amara looked out the window where the morning sunlight was a little brighter than before. She wondered, not for the first time in her life, whether today would be an ordinary flight or a day she would have to remember for a very long time. She had no idea that in just a few minutes everything would change. After Emily Carter left, the first-class cabin returned to its initial quietness, at least outwardly. The familiar sounds of a flight about to take off resumed: the closing of overhead compartments, the gentle rolling of trolleys, the whispered conversations between flight attendants. But for Amara Lewis, the tranquility had a crack in it. She didn't immediately turn around to look. Instead, Amara kept her gaze fixed on the window, as if intently watching a passing luggage cart. In reality, she was listening. Not with her ears, but with an intuition honed over years of living and working in environments where she had always been different. There are things that are very difficult to explain if you haven't experienced them. No one says anything rude. No one raises their voice. No one insults directly. Therefore, if Amara reacts strongly right now, she might be seen as overly sensitive. She was all too familiar with that scenario. Amara took a slow, deep breath. She asked herself a question she had asked countless times in her life. Am I just imagining things? She hated that question, not because it was illogical, but because it was all too familiar. As a student, Amara wondered the same thing when a professor ignored her raised hand time and time again. As a young manager, she wondered the same thing when her ideas were disregarded until a white colleague repeated them almost verbatim. As a senior leader, she wondered the same thing every time she walked into a conference room and saw a fleeting look of surprise on someone's face. Maybe I'm overthinking things. Maybe they didn't mean anything by it. But then, over the years, Amara learned one thing. If a feeling keeps repeating itself, it's no longer just an illusion. She bent down and reopened the small notebook on her lap. Not to write anything more, just to place her hand on it as a way of reminding herself that she was present, alert, and observing. Another flight attendant walked down the aisle. This woman was younger than Emily, probably in her early 20s. Her name tag read Lena Brooks. Lena smiled at Amara, a quick, slightly hesitant smile, then continued on her way. The young woman's eyes held something hard to describe. Not exactly wariness, perhaps confusion. Amara caught that gaze for just a second, but she recognized it immediately. It's the look in someone's eyes, seeing something wrong, but unsure if they're allowed to see it. In the seat in front, the man in the gray suit addressed the flight attendant by name. "Emily, can I get some sparkling water later?" "Of course, Mr. Reynolds," Emily replied. Her voice soft, almost familiar. Amara didn't know who the man was. Nor did she care. But she noticed one small detail: the way Emily pronounced his name. Slowly, respectfully. There was no hint of doubt in her voice. She looked down at her hands again. Amara's hands rested neatly on her lap, her nails short and unpainted. A thin gold ring on her ring finger, a gift she'd bought herself after a career milestone whose true meaning no one but she knew. A simple watch, round face, black leather strap. Unpretentious, unattractive. She had tried to change. She had thought that if she dressed differently, spoke differently, smiled more, was gentler, perhaps things would be easier. But then Amara realized the problem wasn't about how she appeared. The problem lies in how others perceive her even before she has a chance to speak. The loudspeaker announced that the plane's doors were about to close. A few passengers still standing in the aisle quickly found their seats. The atmosphere in the cabin became more tense and heavy, as if everyone was waiting for something. Amara looked up as Emily turned around, this time not stopping at her seat, but continuing toward the back. Emily bent down to speak softly to another passenger, a white woman in her 50s wearing pearl jewelry. Amara couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw a smile on Emily's face. That smile was very different from the expression she had given Amara earlier. It wasn't a bad smile. It was just a smile reserved for someone she believed was in the right place. Amara felt a slight ache in her chest, not painful, just heavy. She leaned her head gently against the back of the chair and closed her eyes for a few seconds. In that brief moment of darkness, memories flooded back. She remembered her mother, Ruth Lewis, a black woman who had worked her whole life in education, always telling her, "You must be better, calmer, and better prepared, because you will never be innocently suspected." Amara lived by that advice. She did everything that people said was right. She studied hard. She worked tirelessly. She didn't let emotions override reason, and yet moments like these still happen. Small, quiet, repeated. She opened her eyes. The cabin was now almost full. The last two empty seats were filled. The sound of the auxiliary engines began to hum low and steady. Amara realized that what weighed heavily on her wasn't the request to see her boarding pass. If that were all, she would have forgotten about it long ago. What wearied her was the accumulation of small moments. Each moment in itself wasn't significant enough to cause a reaction, but together they were enough to wear her down. She wondered, not for the first time, if I speak up today, will I end up making things more complicated? That question always has two answers. And it's never easy. Amara placed her hand on the notebook again. She didn't write anything more. She just touched it as a silent promise to herself that she wouldn't pretend nothing had happened. The plane vibrated slightly as it prepared for taxiing. The captain's voice, deep and firm, boomed over the loudspeaker, announcing a welcome to the passengers. Amara listened, but her mind had drifted far beyond this airplane cabin. Little did she know that very soon she would no longer have the choice between silence and speaking out. That these small signs of disharmony were merely the beginning of something larger and more unavoidable. And that the normalcy she was trying to maintain would soon be challenged in ways she never expected. The plane began to taxi. The sensation of movement was so subtle, almost imperceptible, unless one was truly paying close attention. For many passengers, it was a moment of relaxation. Another flight, a familiar journey. But for Amara Lewis, that moment made her more alert. She opened her eyes, fully adjusted, her posture straightened her back and relaxed her shoulders. It wasn't because she was nervous, but because she had learned that important things often happen when people think everything is all right. The flight attendant's voice rang out again. This time, it was Emily Carter's, clearer and more confident than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard your flight to San Francisco. We are delighted to serve you today." The voice echoed steadily through the first-class cabin. Amara listened, but at the same time she observed. Emily walked down the aisle, stopping at each row of seats. She had a slightly different expression on each passenger's face. No one would notice, unless they had a reason to look. But Amara did. Emily bowed slightly to the man in the gray suit, her smile softening. "Mr. Reynolds, welcome back. It's great to see you again." With the young couple, she spoke faster in a friendly but not overly familiar way. "Let me know if you need anything." As Emily approached seat 1A, her steps slowed ever so slightly. Just one beat. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Amara to see. Emily didn't bend down. She stood tall, maintaining a comfortable distance. The smile was still there, but stiffer. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff, ma'am?" Emily asked. Amara looked up and met Emily's gaze. In that moment, something was clear, undeniable. This isn't just a difference in service. This is a difference in perspective. "Water would be fine, thank you," Amara replied. Emily nodded, jotted down a quick note in her notebook, and walked away. No more words. No further questions. Amara watched her back, then turned to look across the aisle. The man in the opposite seat was being asked if he wanted more lemon in his water. Emily smiled, tilting her head, as if it were a familiar conversation between two people who had met many times before. Amara didn't feel jealous. Nor did she feel explosive anger. What she felt was confirmation. Confirmation that her initial feelings weren't unfounded. She took a deep breath. There's something very difficult to say, especially in stories like this. That is, discrimination doesn't always come in a clear, blatant form. Most of the time it comes down to this subtle, delicate. Enough for those involved to feel it, but not enough for outsiders to speak out. Amara recalled a meeting many years ago when she had just been promoted to a senior executive position. She presented a long, detailed, and well-prepared strategy. The room fell silent after she finished. Then, another man said, "What if we tried something like," and repeated almost her entire idea. Everyone nodded enthusiastically. Nobody thinks they're doing anything wrong, and that's what makes it so annoying. Emily returned with a glass of water. She placed it down on the folding table in front of Amara, the movement precise and swift. "Here you go." "Thank you," Amara replied. Emily didn't linger. No further questions, no friendly greetings. She turned and walked away immediately, as if her task in seat 1A was complete. Amara took a small sip of water. Cool. Ordinary. Nothing special. But in that moment she felt her throat dry up slightly. She wondered, as she had wondered many times before, if I speak out about these things, will anyone listen? Because if Amara were to stand up right now and say that she feels she's been treated differently, the first reaction she'd likely get would be surprise. Then defensiveness. Then denial. "We treat all our passengers the same. That was not my intention. I'm sorry if you feel that way." She had heard all those things before. They were said softly, politely, and usually ended the conversation without changing anything. Amara set down her glass of water and looked out the window. The plane was slowing down, preparing for takeoff. The white lines on the runway glided past evenly. She realized something else. The difference in treatment wasn't just coming from Emily. It was spreading subtly throughout the space. The way the other passengers glanced at her. Not hostile glances. Just curious glances mixed with a touch of suspicion. A woman in the back seat stared at Amara for longer than usual, then quickly looked away when Amara caught her eye. Another man glanced down at her shoes, then back at the seat number plate, as if trying to piece together some kind of story in his head. Amara didn't blame them. She knew how stories are constructed in the human subconscious. Who belongs where? What someone should look like to be reasonable. She has spent her entire career stepping into spaces where others wouldn't expect her to be, and each time she experiences that brief moment of silence, a moment when one has to readjust their assumptions. The engine noise grew louder. The plane accelerated. Amara felt a gentle push pressing her back against the seat. She lightly gripped the armrest, not out of fear, but out of habit. As the plane lifted off, Amara closed her eyes for a few seconds. She always did that, as a small ritual, a way to mark the transition. In that moment of suspension between the ground and the sky, Amara considered a question she had never asked herself so seriously before. What responsibility do I have to deal with what I see? Not everyone has a choice. Not everyone is in a position to speak up. But Amara does. At least in theory. She opened her eyes when the plane had reached a stable altitude. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated. First class was quieter than before, as if everyone was waiting for the next part of the flight. Emily continued serving. This time, she lingered longer at the seat of the man in the gray suit, inquiring about his previous trip and mentioning a different flight. The conversation flowed naturally and comfortably. Amara no longer had any doubts. The difference was clear, and at the same time, something began to stir within her. Not loudly, not explosively, but enough to signal that the silence she was maintaining might not last forever. She didn't know exactly when or how, but Amara sensed that this flight wouldn't go as planned. It wasn't because she wanted it that way, but because sometimes the truth finds its own way of demanding to be seen. The first-class cabin was in its familiar hovering state after takeoff. There was no longer the sound of wheels rolling on the runway. Only the steady, low hum of the engines, like a powerful heartbeat, kept the entire aircraft stable in midair. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated, but some passengers had already begun to relax. Some opened their laptops. Others pulled a thin blanket over their laps. A man in front of Amara leaned back in his seat, sighing in relief as if he had just completed a familiar ritual. Amara Lewis remained seated upright, her gaze fixed on the window. White clouds drifted slowly below, thick and soft like giant piles of cotton. She often enjoyed this moment. The moment when the earth seemed distant and everything appeared to be in a different order. But today, that feeling hasn't arrived yet. There was a noise at the front of the compartment, not loud but distinct enough to attract Amara's attention. The sound of wheels on a small suitcase, the clicking of high heels on the compartment floor, then a voice slightly high-pitched carrying and barely concealed annoyance. Honestly, this is unacceptable. Amara turned her head to look. A couple was standing near the entrance to the first-class cabin. The woman in her 50s had perfectly styled blonde hair and wore a cream-colored blazer. A gleaming metal watch adorned her wrist. The man beside her was tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed gray hair and carried a sturdy leather briefcase. They weren't like passengers who had just boarded a plane. They were like people stepping into a space they firmly believed belonged to them. Emily Carter appeared beside them instantly, faster than Amara expected. Emily's expression changed almost immediately. The professional smile from before was replaced by something softer, more urgent. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitman," Emily said, her voice low and full of concern. "I'm so sorry. What seems to be the problem?" Amara raised her eyebrows slightly. Whitman. The name didn't evoke anything specific in her mind, but the way Emily pronounced it did. The way she stressed it, the way she leaned toward them, as if the entire first-class cabin had shrunk to revolve around those two people. The man, Richard Whitman, exhaled sharply through his nose. "We were supposed to be sitting together. First class. That's what we paid for." The woman, Elaine Whitman, placed her hand on her chest, as if trying to control a great emotion. "And somehow, we're in different rows. This is not how loyal customers should be treated." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for those around her to hear. A few passengers turned to look. Others pretended not to notice, but their ears didn't miss a single word. Emily nodded repeatedly. "I completely understand. Let me take a look and see what I can do." She turned around and took out the passenger list. Amara saw Emily's eyes quickly scan the rows of seats. Very quickly, very purposefully. Amara could guess what was happening without even looking. She had seen this before. Not on airplanes, but in meeting rooms at events and spaces where power operates in a very quiet way. Someone else has a problem. Someone else has chosen to solve that problem. Emily returned with a promising smile. "I'm sure we can find a solution, Miss." Whitman folded her arms, her gaze sweeping across the first-class cabin. Not a curious look, but a judgmental one, as if she were weighing the available options. Amara felt that gaze pass over her. Just for a second, but long enough for her to know that she had been drawn into some kind of calculation. Emily walked down the aisle. Each step seemed a little heavier than the last. As Emily approached seat 1A, Amara knew, not with reason, but with an intuition honed over decades. Emily paused. "Miss Lewis," she said, calling Amara by her first name. Emily's voice was very different now. It wasn't as stiff as when she checked his boarding pass, nor was it as familiar as when she spoke to Mr. Reynolds. It was a carefully crafted blend of politeness and authority. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Amara turned completely around, facing Emily. She didn't smile, but she didn't seem annoyed either. "Sure," Amara replied. Emily lowered her voice. "We have a situation. Some very important passengers were unfortunately not seated together." Amara waited. She didn't interrupt. She wanted to hear what Emily would say next. "They're longtime elite customers," Emily continued. "And I was wondering if you'd be willing to help us by switching seats." Amara looked directly at Emily. "Switch seats with whom?" she asked. Emily hesitated slightly, then leaned to one side, gesturing towards the Whitmans who were waiting at the front of the compartment. "They would really appreciate it. And of course we'd compensate you. A travel voucher, additional miles." The words flowed smoothly, as if Emily had rehearsed them in her head. Not a single word was superfluous. Not a single word sounded forced. But Amara heard very clearly what lay behind those words. They are more important. They deserve more. And you should understand that. Amara didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her seat, then up at the seat number above. 1A. She remembered exactly when she booked the ticket. She remembered the price. She remembered why she chose this seat. Not because it was luxurious. Because she knew she would need some quiet space for this trip. "Why me?" Amara asked, her voice still calm. Emily blinked. "Well, you're traveling alone, and it would just be easier." Easier. Amara repeated the word in her head. She felt something very old, very familiar, resurfacing. A feeling she thought she had overcome. Is there a problem with my seat? Amara continued asking. Is there a safety issue? Emily shook her head immediately. Oh no, not at all. An operational necessity, Amara continued. Emily was silent for a brief moment. No. It's just a matter of customer service. Amara nodded slowly. In that moment, so much was happening inside her. Exhaustion, suppressed anger, and an unavoidable question. Should I give in, as I've done so many times before? She knew the consequences of giving in. Everything would be fine. The flight would continue. No one would be disturbed. No one would be further inconvenienced. But Amara also knew the price. The price of shrinking herself. She looked up and stared directly at Emily. I paid for this seat, Amara said slowly, and I'd like to keep it. There was no challenge in her voice. Only the truth. Emily froze for a very brief moment. Then she forced a different, more strained smile. I understand, Emily said. But I really hope you'll reconsider. At the front of the cabin, Mrs. Whitman let out a dramatic sigh. Several passengers began to pay closer attention. The atmosphere in first class changed noticeably. It was as if an invisible string had just been pulled taut. Amara sensed it, and she knew that from this moment on this flight would no longer be simple. The first-class cabin suddenly became quiet in a very different way. It wasn't the pleasant tranquility of the first few minutes of the flight, but a tense, strained silence, like the surface of water before something falls. Amara Lewis felt it acutely. She didn't need to look around to know that many eyes were fixed on seat 1A. Emily Carter remained standing there, leaning slightly toward Amara, maintaining just enough distance so as not to appear too intrusive, but close enough to confirm that the conversation was not over. Miss Lewis, Emily continued, her voice softening slightly, as if trying to steer the conversation toward a more pleasant direction. I completely respect your position. Amara didn't reply. She looked straight at Emily, her gaze calm. She had learned that in situations like this, silence could be a form of active listening. Emily cleared her throat. It's just that Mr. and Mrs. Whitman have had a long journey already. They've been very understanding customers over the years. Amara heard the word understanding and almost burst out laughing, but she held back. Not because she found it funny, but because she was tired. Where would I be seated? Amara asked in a flat tone. Emily quickly replied, as if she had prepared the answer. In row 3. It's still a very comfortable seat. Same cabin. Amara nodded slowly. Is it a window seat? Emily shook her head. No, it's an aisle seat. Is it available because someone volunteered? Amara continued asking. Emily hesitated for a very brief moment. No, it's currently assigned. Amara understood immediately. She was asked to give up her seat not because someone else was willing, but because she was considered the easiest option. She turned her head to look at the Whitman couple. Elaine Whitman was standing with her arms crossed, her eyes betraying her impatience. Richard Whitman leaned towards Emily, whispering something that Amara couldn't quite hear, but she could clearly see Emily nodding repeatedly. That scene brought another memory to Amara's mind. One evening many years ago, at a fundraising event, she had been mistaken for a server. She was given an empty tray and told to take it. When she gently explained that she was a guest, the person blushed and stammered an apology. But the feeling of being misplaced lingered for a long time. Amara turned to look at Emily. You said it would be easier, she said. Easier for whom? Emily blinked. For everyone, she replied quickly. So we can all enjoy a smooth flight. A perfect answer. No one is directly blamed. No one is named. But Amara knew very well that everyone in that statement didn't include her. Emily, Amara said, calling the flight attendant by her first name. I want to understand something clearly. Emily tensed slightly but still managed to smile. Of course. Is there any policy that requires me to give up my assigned seat in this situation? Amara asked. Emily shook her head. No, it's completely voluntary. Amara nodded. Then I'm choosing not to volunteer. The words were spoken softly, without any challenge. But their impact was clear. Emily froze. The smile on her lips stiffened for a moment before being replaced by a different, more unreadable expression. I understand, Emily said, her voice slightly lowered. But I really hope you'll think about the bigger picture here. The bigger picture. Amara felt a slight warmth spread up the back of her neck. She knew what the big picture Emily was talking about was. It was the convenience for those considered more important. Help me understand the bigger picture, Amara said. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I'm being asked to fix a problem I didn't create. Emily took a deep breath. I'm just trying to offer a solution. By asking me to move, Amara replied. Yes. At the front of the compartment, Mrs. Whitman spoke up, no longer holding back. This is ridiculous, Elaine said, her voice loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. We shouldn't even have to ask. A few passengers began to murmur. Some looked down at their phones. Some looked at the ceiling of the cabin. Some glanced quickly at Amara and then turned away, as if afraid of being drawn into an awkward situation. Amara realized that the crowd's silence was beginning to carry weight. She looked at Emily. Is there anyone else you've asked to switch seats? Amara asked. Emily didn't answer immediately. The silence lasted a beat, then 2 beats. No, Emily said finally. Not yet. Not yet. Amara understood. If she disagreed, Emily might ask someone else. But she also understood something else. Emily had chosen her first for a reason. She wondered what she should do next. React. Instinctively. Stand up, speak louder, or continue to maintain this calm tone. She thought of her mother, of the advice she'd given years ago. You must choose your own battle. Amara placed both hands on the armrests of the chair, feeling the cool leather against her palms. I'm not moving, she said slowly and clearly. And I'd like to enjoy the seat I paid for. Emily looked at Amara, her eyes revealing suppressed annoyance. Miss Lewis, I'm trying to resolve this professionally. And I'm responding professionally, Amara replied. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't broken any rules. Emily leaned closer, lowering her voice. I don't think you want this to become a bigger issue. Amara looked directly at Emily. What issue? She asked. Me sitting quietly in my assigned seat. In front, Richard Whitman stood up. He took a few steps toward Amara, standing in the aisle, casting a large shadow that obscured the lights above. Look, he said, his voice low and tinged with impatience. My wife and I have had a very long week. This shouldn't be so complicated. Amara looked up at him. I'm sure you have, she replied. I have too. Elaine Whitman crossed her arms more tightly. Some people just don't understand how things work, she said, without looking directly at Amara. That sentence was like a small, sharp needle piercing the air. Amara felt her heart beat a little faster. Not from fear, but from the painful familiarity of that kind of speech. She looked around the compartment, averted faces, eyes that refused to make eye contact. She knew this feeling all too well. The feeling of being the only one standing still, while everyone else wishes you would disappear so everything could go back to normal. Amara took a deep breath. Emily, she said, turning back to the flight attendant. If you believe I'm violating any rule, you're welcome to tell me which one. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. No answer came. Otherwise, Amara continued, her voice still calm. I'm staying right here. In that moment, Amara felt something very clearly. The choice had been made. No more hesitation. No more avoidance. The first-class cabin fell into an even heavier silence than before. Emily stood there stiff, as if considering her next move. At the front of the cabin, the Whitmans exchanged glances, their eyes filled with frustration. Amara leaned back in her seat, gazing out the window. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly blue. The plane continued its journey despite the tension building inside. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she had stopped shrinking herself. And that whether right or wrong in the eyes of others changed everything. Amara Lewis' words. No one spoke up. No one objected. No one took her side. Only the steady hum of the airplane engines echoed, a cold, detached backdrop to a moment everyone recognized as abnormal, yet no one wanted to touch. Emily Carter remained standing in the aisle, her hands clutching a small notebook. Her face was tense, no longer retaining its initial gentle expression. She looked at Amara for a few seconds, then glanced quickly towards the Whitman couple as if searching for guidance. Richard Whitman shook his head, his lips pressed together. Elaine Whitman crossed her arms, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her expression firm, as if the decision had already been made. Amara could clearly feel the gazes of the other passengers. Some looked at her with annoyance, as if thinking, just give way. Why make it so complicated? Others looked at her with subtle pity. And still others looked at her with a faint glimmer of empathy, but not strong enough to translate into action. That silence wasn't neutral. It carried weight. Amara realized that in situations like this, the silence of the crowd often sided with the one in power. Not because they believed that person was right, but because it was safer to side with them. She had witnessed this in meetings, in wrong decisions that no one dared to object to, in stories that were ignored because no one wanted to be the troublemaker. Amara placed her hands on her thighs, her fingers lightly intertwined. She noticed her heart was beating faster than usual. Not strongly, not erratically, just a little faster. Her body was reacting, though her face remained calm. She asked herself a very genuine question. Am I making things more difficult than they need to be? If she stood up right now, giving up her seat, everything would be over. Emily would smile. The Whitmans would be pleased. The flight would continue peacefully. And Amara would be sitting in a different seat looking out the aisle instead of the window. No one would call it a failure. No one would say she did something wrong. But Amara knew she would remember that moment for a long time. She will remember the feeling of standing up and walking away in silence. Remember the gazes of those around her, some breathing a sigh of relief. Remember the feeling that she had once again chosen the convenience of others over fairness for herself. She has done that many times before. The first time was when she was 23 working at a small consulting firm. She remained silent when a colleague joked about diversity hire. The second time was when she was 30 during a presentation when she let someone interrupt her. The third, fourth, fifth. Each time, there was a valid reason. It's not worth making a fuss. Not now. It's a small matter. But those small things accumulate. They don't disappear. They settle, forming a heavy layer of sediment deep within. Amara looked up, gazing forward in the cabin. Soft light shone down on the rows of light-colored leather seats. Everything looked luxurious, perfectly orderly. And it was in this supposedly high-class space that injustice unfolded in its most subtle way. Emily Carter took a deep breath. "Miss Lewis," she said, her voice now distinctly different. No longer soft nor entirely harsh. It was the voice of someone trying to maintain control. "I need you to understand that you're putting me in a difficult position." Amara nodded slowly. "I understand," she said, "but I didn't put you there." The answer made Emily freeze. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. A few seconds passed in silence. Emily Lena Brooks, the young flight attendant, called from behind. Lena's voice was low, but loud enough for Amara to hear. "Do you want me to check something in the back?" Emily turned to look at Lena, her eyes flashing sharply for a split second. "No," she replied quickly. "I've got it." Lena bowed her head and stepped back. Amara caught the young woman's gaze for a fleeting moment. It was a look filled with conflict. She wanted to say something, but was afraid. She wanted to do the right thing, but didn't know what the consequences would be. Amara felt a slight sadness creeping into her heart. She remembered herself many years ago, standing just like that. Just like that. Not because she didn't know what was right, but because the price of speaking up back then was too high. She turned to look at Emily. "Is there anything else you need from me?" Amara asked. Emily bit her lip. "If you continue to refuse, I may have to escalate this." "Escalate how?" Amara asked, her voice still calm. Emily didn't answer immediately. She glanced around, as if weighing the seriousness of the words she was about to say. "I can call a supervisor," Emily said finally. "And possibly involving security." The security guard dropped into the aircraft cabin like a heavy object. Amara was acutely aware of her body's reaction. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, her back straightened. Familiar images flashed through her mind, videos, stories, people being ushered off planes under the curious gaze of crowds. She had read about them, she had seen them, and she knew that for a black woman that threat was never just theoretical. Amara took a deep breath. She didn't want to let fear dictate her reaction. But she also couldn't pretend that the fear didn't exist. She looked down at her hands. They were still firm, not trembling, not clenched. "Emily," Amara said, her voice slightly lower but clear. "I haven't broken any rules. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't been disruptive." Emily swallowed. "That's not how it looks." "Looks to whom?" Amara asked. Emily didn't answer. Silence fell over the first-class cabin. A few passengers began to show signs of restlessness. Some coughed softly, some shifted their positions. Some glanced at their watches as if worried the flight might be delayed. Amara realized something very clearly in that moment. The pressure wasn't just coming from Emily or the Whitman couple. It was coming from the entire space. It stems from the collective desire of the crowd that it should all end. And end in the easiest way possible. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not to escape, but to listen to herself. If I stand firm here, she thought, who am I doing this for? For myself, for the older versions of myself who were once silent. And perhaps for people like Lena who are watching but unable to speak. Amara opened her eyes. I'm not going anywhere, she said slowly. And if you need to escalate this, that's your choice. Emily looked at Amara, her eyes a mixture of anger and worry. She turned and walked quickly towards the front of the compartment. Amara heard a whisper. I'll call it in. She knew this had crossed a point of no return. The first-class cabin remained quiet. But now that quiet was no longer one of waiting. It was a tightly compressed tension ready to erupt at any moment. Amara leaned back in her chair, staring straight ahead. She didn't know exactly who would appear next, but she knew that from this moment on all eyes would be fixed on her. The first-class cabin has never been quieter than it is now. It wasn't the tranquility of a peaceful morning or a smooth flight. It was a tense, oppressive silence like the air before a storm. Everyone sensed something was coming, but no one knew exactly when. Amara Lewis sat upright, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She didn't move. She didn't look around. She didn't try to find a supportive gaze. She had moved past that stage. At the front of the compartment, Emily Carter leaned over the intercom mounted on the wall. She covered her mouth with her hand as she spoke, but not enough for Amara to miss the disjointed words escaping. Refusing to comply, causing disruption, need assistance. Amara closed her eyes for a brief second. She had heard these words before, not in her own context, but in countless stories shared in newspapers and in viral videos online. These seemingly neutral words, when combined, could quickly turn a person sitting quietly into a problem. She opened her eyes when she heard Emily slam the phone back down on the stand. Emily turned around and walked down the aisle with a more stern demeanor than before. She stopped at seat 1, straightened up, and no longer tried to maintain a soft tone of voice. Miss Lewis, Emily said, her voice low but clear. I've contacted my supervisor, and security has been notified. Some passengers took very quiet breaths. Some shifted in their seats. Some turned their heads away, as if unwilling to witness what was about to happen. Amara felt her heart beat a little faster. Not out of surprise. She had anticipated this. But the anticipation didn't lessen the feeling. On what grounds? Amara asked, her voice still even. Emily clenched her jaw. For refusing a crew request. Amara nodded. A voluntary request, she emphasized. Which I declined. Emily didn't respond. She just stood there, her gaze fixed as if waiting for another force to appear and take over the situation. At the front of the compartment, Elaine Whitman shook her head and sighed dramatically. This is unbelievable, she said loud enough for a few people to hear. All this over a seat. Richard Whitman folded his arms, his cold gaze sweeping over Amara before settling on Emily. This shouldn't have gone this far, he said. But here we are. Amara looked at them but didn't react. She knew that in the story they were telling themselves, she had become the one complicating things, and no logical argument could change that feeling because that feeling wasn't built on logic. The cabin vibrated slightly as the airflow changed. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Time seemed to slow down, each second dragging on longer than usual. Amara asked herself a very practical question. What will happen if security comes up here? She pictured herself being ordered to stand up, being led down a narrow aisle under the gaze of others, being turned into a story someone would later tell with a voice tinged with pity and judgment. She felt a slight chill run down her spine. Amara has achieved so much in her life. She has walked through doors that few others like her could have entered. But she also understands one thing very well. Power isn't always immediately recognized. And until it was named, she remained just a black woman sitting in seat 1, a considered uncooperative. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air, then exhaled slowly. She needed to keep her voice steady. She needed to keep her body calm. Not because she was wrong, but because any sign of emotion at this moment could be interpreted in the most unfavorable way. Emily, Amara said, her voice low but firm. I'd like to document this interaction. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Amara took out her small notebook and turned to a new page. I'm taking notes, she said. Time, names, exact statements. Emily was startled. You can't do that. Is there a policy that prohibits written notes? Amara asked. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't have an answer right away. In the back seat, Lena Brooks stood still, her hands gripping her apron. The young woman's gaze was fixed on Amara, then quickly turned away when Emily glanced behind her. Amara wrote a few brief lines. She didn't write quickly. She wrote clearly word by word, not to provoke, but to assert her presence and alertness. Stop that, Emily said, her voice slightly louder than before. You're escalating the situation. Amara looked up. I'm documenting it, she replied. There's a difference. Emily breathed heavily. Security will be here shortly. Amara nodded. I'll wait. At that moment, the first-class cabin froze. Everyone heard it. No one said anything. No one stood up. No one intervened. Amara realized that this was the moment many people feared most. The moment when things hadn't yet exploded, but also couldn't return to normal. The in-between moment where one person's choice could make the entire space uncomfortable. She recalled a conversation from many years ago when a white man asked her, "How do you stay so calm all the time?" At the time, Amara smiled and gave a vague answer. But the truth is her calmness wasn't instinctive. It was the result of many times learning to control her own fear. Footsteps echoed from the front of the compartment. No rush, no urgency, but it's weighty enough for everyone to realize that what was being talked about has arrived. Two security officers appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin. One was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a stern expression. The other was younger, with sharp eyes that quickly scanned the entire space before stopping at Emily. Emily stepped forward immediately. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice hurried. "We have a passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions." The older security guard nodded, then turned to look at Amara. His gaze lingered on her face, on the notebook in her hand on seat 1A. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "I'm going to need you to step out of your seat." Amara looked at him, her heart pounding a little faster, but her voice remained steady. "Before I do that," she said, "could you please tell me what rule I've violated?" The security guard paused slightly. He glanced at Emily. Emily quickly replied, "She's determined a crew request and causing a disturbance." Amara shook her head slightly. "I've been seated quietly this entire time," she said. "I declined a voluntary seat change. That's all." The younger security officer stepped forward, his gaze scrutinizing Amara more closely. "Is that accurate?" he asked Emily. Emily hesitated for a very brief moment. "She's being uncooperative," she said. Amara took a deep breath. "Uncooperative is not a violation," she said. "I'd like that noted as well." The atmosphere in the cabin became so heavy it was almost palpable. Amara felt everyone's eyes on her. Some passengers lowered their heads. Others stared straight ahead without blinking. In that moment, Amara understood that things had gone too far to be resolved by compromise. Whatever the outcome, this story wouldn't end here. She kept her gaze direct, neither provocative nor pleading. She knew that the only thing she could control at this moment was how she presented herself, and she chose to be present in a way that reflected her true values. The first-class cabin was filled with a sense of anticipation. Two security officers stood in the aisle, their figures partially obscuring the overhead lights, casting long shadows on the cabin floor. Amara Lewis felt the change in atmosphere acutely. It was no longer a vague pressure. This was a pressure with form and weight. The older security officer stood near seat 1A. He wasn't aggressive, but his voice carried a familiar authority. One Amara had heard many times in her life, the authority of someone who could decide what would happen next. "Ma'am," he repeated more slowly, "I'm asking you to step out of your seat so we can resolve this." Amara looked straight at him. She didn't stand up. Not out of defiance, but because she needed to make sure every step she took was meaningful. "I'm happy to cooperate," Amara said, "but I need clarity first." The younger security officer tilted his head, his gaze scrutinizing. "What kind of clarity about why I'm asked being to leave my seat?" Amara replied. "And whether this request is based on any violation." A few passengers in the back began to whisper softly. No one spoke loudly, but those low sounds were enough to remind Amara that every word spoken now had an audience. Emily Carter stood directly behind the two security guards, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. She looked both tense and uncomfortable, as if the situation had spiraled out of control as she had hoped. She's desperate for a crew instruction, Emily said, her voice urgent. And it's disrupting service. Amara turned to look at Emily. I declined a voluntary seat change, she said clearly. That's not a disruption. The older security guard raised his hand to signal silence, then turned to Emily. Was it voluntary, he asked. Emily blinked. Yes, but then she has the right to decline, the security guard said in a flat tone. At that moment, Amara felt a fleeting glimmer of relief. Very small, very fragile, but it was enough for her to know that at least the story hadn't been completely distorted. However, that relief didn't last long. The young security officer took another step forward. Even so, he said, we still need to assess whether this situation is escalating. Amara understood. She had seen this kind of language before. Not directly accusing, but leaving room for all possibilities. She placed the notebook down on the table, folded it, and opened her hands, palms facing up, an unconscious gesture intended to convey a non-threatening attitude. I'm seated, she said. I'm calm. I'm speaking respectfully. I'm not interfering with anyone else's safety. The young security officer stared at Amara for longer than necessary. His gaze swept over her face, her upright posture, her notebook. Then he glanced at Whitman's briefcase. Elaine Whitman stood nearby, her face flushed with anger. This is outrageous, she said. We're the ones being inconvenienced. Ma'am, the older security officer turned to her. Please step back to your seat. Elaine opened her mouth to say more, but Richard Whitman placed his hand on his wife's arm, pulling her back. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes as he gazed at Amara betrayed his displeasure. The plane vibrated slightly, a signal reminding them they were still flying tens of thousands of feet above the ground, in the middle of the sky, where no one could simply step out. Amara felt her throat dry up. She swallowed very gently. She didn't want to show any sign of tension. She knew that for people like her, calmness wasn't just a choice, it was a shield. She recalled a leadership training session years ago, when a consultant told her, in moments of conflict, your presence speaks louder than your argument. Amara took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. May I ask your names? She asked the two security guards. The older security officer was slightly surprised but still replied, I'm Officer Daniels. The younger man nodded. Officer Perez. Amara nodded quickly, jotting down two names in her notebook. Thank you, she said. Emily frowned. You don't need their names. Amara looked up at Emily. I do, she replied. Silence spread again. But this time, it wasn't entirely unfavorable to Amara. A few passengers began looking at the two security officers differently. No longer was there the expectation of just get her out of here, but rather cautious observation. Amara realized something very important. When an event is named and recorded, it can no longer be easily overlooked. Miss Lewis, Officer Daniels said, his voice softening slightly. We're trying to keep everyone safe and comfortable. I understand, Amara replied. That's what I want too. Then help us help you, Officer Perez said. Amara looked at him. Tell me how, she said. Officer Perez glanced at Emily, then at Amara. If you step out into the aisle, we can talk privately. Amara considered the offer. She understood that stepping down from her seat could be interpreted in many ways. But she also understood that if she didn't show a willingness to cooperate, the situation could escalate to an unfavorable outcome. Will I be allowed to return to my seat afterwards? Amara asked. Officer Daniels hesitated for a moment. That depends on how the conversation goes. That answer offered no guarantee. Amara looked down at seat 1A. The seat looked exactly as it had, neat and quiet, as if unaware that it had become the focal point of a much larger confrontation. She recalled why she had chosen this seat. Not because it was in the front row, not because of the comfort, but because she needed some space to think during this trip. Now that space is being threatened in a different way. Amara looked up. I'm willing to speak, she said, but I'm not standing up unless you can tell me exactly why. Officer Daniels exhaled slowly. We're receiving reports that the situation is making other passengers uncomfortable. Amara looked around the compartment. Has anyone here told you they feel unsafe? She asked. No one spoke up. No one raised their hand. No one nodded. This silence speaks volumes. Officer Perez frowned. No one has spoken up, he admitted. Amara nodded. Then I suggested we address the actual issue, she said, which is a seating dispute, not a safety concern. Emily exclaimed. This is going nowhere. Officer Daniels turned to Emily. Emily, step back for a moment, he said. Emily froze, then reluctantly took a few steps back. In that moment, Amara sensed a subtle shift in the balance of power. Not enough to change the outcome, but enough to create a gap. She knew that if this story continued in its current direction, something bigger would have to happen. Either she would be asked to leave the plane, or a different truth would come to light. Amara placed her hand on the notebook, squeezing it gently. She didn't know which direction to go, but she knew that the decisive moment was drawing near. And when it comes, she won't shy away from it. The first-class cabin fell into a prolonged silence. Gone was the tense silence of the past, replaced by a heavy stillness, as if everyone understood they had entered a moment of decisive action. Amara Lewis sensed it. She didn't need to look around to know that everyone was asking the same question. Where will this lead? Officer Daniels stood upright, his hands clasped in front of his stomach, his gaze fixed on Amara. Officer Perez tilted his head slightly, as if trying to read something from her calm expression. Miss Lewis, Officer Daniels said, his voice lower and slower than before, we need to resolve this before it escalates further. Amara nodded. I agree, she replied. Then we need your cooperation, he continued. At this point, the easiest way forward is for you to step out of your seat so we can de-escalate. De-escalate. Amara heard the word echo in her head. A word that sounded perfectly reasonable, very professional. But she also knew that in reality, de-escalate usually meant that the less powerful person had to give in. She looked down at seat one more time. That seat was no longer just a place to sit. It had become a symbol of something bigger, the right to be in the place you paid to be, without having to explain or ask permission. Amara looked up. Officer Daniels, she said, if I stand up now, am I being removed from the aircraft? He fell silent for a longer than usual pause. It's a possibility, he said finally. If the situation can't be resolved. Some passengers took very quiet breaths. Some closed their eyes as if they didn't want to hear anymore. Some opened their phones, but their eyes still glanced upwards. Amara felt a tightness in her chest. Not pain, just a heaviness. She thought of the big meetings, the multi-million-dollar decisions, the times when a single word from her could change the fate of thousands. She had faced far greater pressure than this before. But this pressure is different. There were no meeting rooms here. No lawyers by her side. No support staff. Just her, a black woman, sitting in the middle of an airplane cabin filled with stairs. She recalled a moment long ago when she was a student being asked to leave by a security guard in the library because she didn't look like a student. That day, she stood up, packed her things, and left in silence. Not because she was wrong, but because she didn't want to cause trouble. That feeling is still there. Amara placed the notebook on her lap, her fingers gently touching the edge of the paper. She knew that what she did in the next few minutes would haunt her for a long time, no matter the outcome. May I ask one more question, she said. Officer Daniels nodded. Go ahead. Has anyone officially complained that I'm a threat to safety? Amara asked. Officer Daniels shook his head. No. Has anyone said I've been verbally abusive? She continued. No. Physically aggressive? No. Amara nodded slowly. Then, what exactly are we resolving? No one answered immediately. Emily Carter stood behind him, arms crossed, her eyes betraying her annoyance. She's refusing to cooperate, Emily said. That's enough. Amara turned to look at Emily. Cooperate with what she asked. Giving up something that's mine. Emily bit her lip. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Amara smiled very faintly. Not sarcastically. Not mockingly. Just a sad smile. I'm not the one who started this, she said. But I might be the one who ends it. The statement left Emily speechless for a split second. In the back seat, Lena Brooks stood motionless like a statue. The young woman looked at Amara with a mixture of anxiety and admiration. Amara caught her gaze and understood perfectly what Lena was thinking. I wish I could have been that calm. I wish I could have said the right thing. Amara turned around to face the two security guards. Officers, she said, lowering her voice slightly. I'm trying to be very careful with my words here. Officer Perez nodded as if encouraging her to continue. There's a reason I'm asking so many questions, Amara said. And there's a reason I'm documenting this. Officer Daniels frowned slightly. What reason is that? Amara paused for a second. This was the moment she had been trying to postpone from the beginning. Not because she was ashamed. Not because she was afraid. but because she knew that once this truth was revealed, everything would change immediately. And she hated having to use her title as a shield. For years, Amara tried not to let her title define how others treated her. She wanted to be heard for what she had to say, not for the chair she held. But life doesn't always work that way. She took a deep breath. Because Amara said slowly, word by word, I know how these situations tend to be written up later. Emily frowned even more. What are you talking about? I know how narratives are created, Amara continued. I know how words like uncooperative and disruptive can follow someone long after a flight lands. Officer Perez looked at Amara more closely. You've been through this before, he asked. Amara nodded. In different forms, she said. Enough times to recognize the pattern. The first-class cabin fell silent again. But this time, the silence carried a different feeling. It wasn't just tension, but anticipation. Amara looked down at the notebook, then looked up again. She could clearly feel her heartbeat in her chest. Not too fast, not erratic, but enough to remind her that this was a crucial moment in this story. She asked herself one last question. If I don't speak up now, am I letting this happen again to someone else? For Lena, for the other passengers who were asked to help, for those who will be boarding this flight after her. Amara closed her eyes for a very brief second. When she opened them, her gaze was different. Not sharper, not harder, just that the decision had been made. Officers, she said, her voice steady, before I stand up or move anywhere, there's something you need to know. Officer Daniels tilted his head slightly. And that is, Amara kept her eyes fixed on him. I'm not just another passenger, she said. Emily chuckled softly, full of skepticism. Everyone says that. Amara didn't look at Emily. I'm the chief executive officer of this airline, she continued, and my name is Amara Lewis. The air in the cabin felt like it was freezing. For the first few seconds, no one reacted. There was no whispering, no heavy breathing, no denial. There was only a thick, heavy silence, so intense that Amara could almost hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Officer Daniels blinked. Excuse me, he said. Officer Perez looked at Amara, then at the notebook in her hand, then at seat 1A. You're saying? Yes, Amara said, her voice still even. I am. Emily froze. Her face turned pale very quickly, as if the blood had just drained from it. That can't be. Amara opened her handbag and took out a slim wallet. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't make any dramatic gestures to impress. She simply did what needed to be done. She handed over a business card. Officer Daniels took it. His eyes scanned the name, the title, the familiar logo. His expression changed almost instantly. Officer Perez walked closer, looking over his colleague's shoulder. Oh, he whispered. Oh, wow. Emily took a step back, as if she had just realized she was standing on the brink of something very big. The first-class cabin was no longer quiet, but the sounds that began to emerge now, breathing, whispering, the shifting of seats, all shared the same tone. Everything has turned around. Amara sat still in seat 1, a back straight, hands resting lightly on her lap. She didn't smile. She showed no sign of triumph. She simply stared straight ahead, like someone who had spoken the truth and was waiting for the world to catch up. For the first few seconds after Amara Lewis revealed her identity, the first-class cabin seemed to stop functioning. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the familiar sound of the engine seemed to fade into the distance, becoming a vague background noise. Officer Daniels still held the business card in his hand. He looked down at it one more time, as if to make sure his eyes weren't mistaken. The familiar logo. The familiar title. A name that in this context carried more weight than any justification. He looked up at Amara. Miss Lewis, he said, his voice different. No longer the voice of someone handling an incident. It was the voice of someone who had just realized they were standing before the highest authority in the system. I wasn't aware. Amara nodded slightly. I understand, she replied. That's kind of the point. The words drifted through the airplane cabin like a whisper, not sharp, not sarcastic, but enough for everyone to understand that what had just happened was not just a personal misunderstanding. Officer Perez stood still, his eyes darting quickly from Amara to Emily Carter, then back to the notebook on the folding table. He swallowed. Ma'am, he said, addressing her with noticeable reserve for the first time. If you are who you say you are, then this changes everything. Amara looked at him. It shouldn't, she said. But it does. At the front of the compartment, Emily Carter's face turned pale. Her hands trembled slightly, a tremor she could no longer conceal. Her professional smile had completely vanished, revealing an embarrassed, frightened expression. I I didn't know, Emily stammered. If I had known, Amara raised her hand, slightly signaling them to stop. That's not the issue, she said. And that's exactly why this matters. Emily stood still, as if frozen. In the seat across from him, Richard Whitman's eyes widened. Then he quickly turned to his wife. Elaine Whitman shook her head, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. CEO, Elaine whispered. She's the CEO. A few passengers began whispering to each other. Not loudly, not explosively, but clearly. Pieces of information were piecing together rapidly in their minds. Details that had previously seemed disjointed now became unsettlingly clear. Seat 1A, calmness. Precise questions. Amara remained seated. She wasn't savoring the moment. She wasn't seeking admiring glances. In fact, she felt something quite different, a quiet sadness. Because she knew that only when she stated her title would people begin to listen, and that shouldn't be a condition for being treated fairly. Officer Daniels cleared his throat. Miss Lewis, he said, I apologize for the way this situation has been handled. Amara looked at him. I appreciate that, she replied, but an apology alone doesn't fix what happened. He nodded slowly. You're right. He turned to Officer Perez. Let's step back, he said. There's no safety issue here. Officer Perez nodded and took a step back. The atmosphere in the compartment changed instantly. The tension eased slightly like a string that had just been loosened. Emily took a step forward, her voice trembling. Miss Lewis, I'm truly sorry. I never meant. Intent doesn't erase impact, Amara said, her voice still light. And this isn't about me feeling offended. Emily bowed her head. I understand. Do you? Amara asked. Emily looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I think I'm starting to. Behind her, Lena Brooks stood still, but her eyes widened. The young woman looked at Amara as if she were seeing something completely new, an image of power that didn't need to be loud to exist. Amara turned to look at Lena very quickly. Just a glance. But it was enough for Lena to understand that she wasn't invisible. Officer Daniels, Amara said, turning to the security officer, I'd like a full report of this incident. Yes, ma'am, he replied immediately. We'll document everything. I want names, timestamps, and the exact language that was used, Amara said. Not to punish, she added, but to understand. Emily trembled slightly. I'll cooperate fully, she said. Good, Amara replied. She turned to the Whitman couple. Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, she said, her voice polite, not harsh. I understand you wanted to sit together. Elaine Whitman blushed. Yes, well, we didn't know. I know, Amara said. And that's the issue. Richard Whitman cleared his throat. We didn't mean any harm. Amara looked at him. Harm doesn't require intent, she said. Just opportunity. The remark caused Richard Whitman to lower his head and remain silent. Emily, Amara said, is there a policy that allows moving passengers against their will to accommodate preferences? Emily shook her head. No. Then, that's something we need to address, Amara said. She turned to Officer Daniels. I'd like the cabin to return to normal operations, she said. And I'd like everyone to take their assigned seats. Officer Daniels nodded. Of course. Emily turned to the Whitmans, her voice much softer than before. Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, please return to your seats. Elaine Whitman opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked at Amara once more, her eyes a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. Then she turned and walked back to her seat. The first-class cabin gradually returned to its old rhythm, but not entirely. Something had changed permanently in this space, as if a curtain had just been drawn back, revealing what everyone had previously tried to ignore. Amara leaned back in seat 1A. She felt her heartbeat gradually stabilize. Not because the tension had completely disappeared, but because she had gotten through the hardest part. She looked out the window. The sky was still blue, the clouds still drifted. The plane was still flying. The world outside knew nothing of it, but inside this cabin, an order had been challenged. Amara didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible. Because now she's not just a passenger. She's the one who will have to decide what happens next. After Officer Daniels and Officer Perez stepped back, the first-class compartment didn't immediately return to its usual rhythm. The silence was no longer as tense as before, but it wasn't peaceful either. It was a stillness in motion, like the surface of a lake after a stone has been dropped. Amara Lewis leaned back in seat one, her shoulders slightly more relaxed than they had been a few minutes earlier. She felt her heartbeat slow, not because it was over, but because the confrontational phase was over. What remained was the aftershock, and sometimes the aftershock is the hardest part to deal with. In the front seat, the man in the gray suit, Mr. Reynolds, turned around. He hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile. "Miss Lewis," he said, his voice low so as not to attract too much attention. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Amara turned to him. Sorry for what she asked, not to question him, but to open a space for honesty, Mr. Reynolds exhaled. For not saying anything earlier, he replied, "I saw what was happening. I just didn't think it was my place." Amara nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. "That feeling is very common." He nodded, his eyes showing a hint of embarrassment. "I didn't realize how wrong it felt until everything stopped being hypothetical." Amara looked at him, then smiled very slightly. "That's usually how it happens," she said. He returned to his seat, but Amara noticed something. The initial silence had been broken. In the back seat, a middle-aged woman with dark brown hair leaned toward Amara. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," she said softly, "but I've been asked to switch seats before. More than once." Amara turned around, her gaze softening. "And did you?" she asked. The woman smiled sadly. "Yes," she replied. "Every time." Amara didn't say anything immediately. She let the silence linger. "Did it feel voluntary?" she asked after a pause. The woman shook her head. "It felt expected." It hung suspended in midair. "Expected?" Amara nodded. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "That matters." Across the aisle, an older man, perhaps in his 70s, cleared his throat and spoke. "I didn't like how this was handled," he said, not looking directly at Amara but straight ahead. It brought back memories. Of what Amara asked. "Of being told where I belonged," he replied. "And where I didn't." No one asked any further questions. There was no need to ask. Such stories were self-explanatory. Amara realized that in just a few minutes, the first-class cabin had transformed into a very different space. No longer a place of isolated individuals, each in their own world. It had become a temporary community where buried experiences began to find their voice. At the front of the compartment, Emily Carter stood still near the galley, her hands clasped together. Her face was no longer as pale as before, but it hadn't returned to normal yet. She avoided looking at Amara as if afraid that gaze would remind her of what had just happened. Lena Brooks approached Amara, walking slowly and cautiously. "Miss Lewis," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you." Amara looked at Lena, her eyes warm. "For what?" she asked. "For not backing down," Lena replied. "And for not making it about yourself." Amara smiled. "It's always about more than one person," she said, "even when it doesn't look like it." Lena nodded, her eyes brightening. "I didn't know what to do earlier," she confessed. "But watching you, it changed something for me." Amara placed her hand on Lena's arm very gently just for a second. "You'll know when it's your moment," she said. "And when it comes, trust yourself." Lena swallowed, nodded, and turned away, her steps seemingly more steady than when she arrived. At the front of the compartment, Officer Daniels was having a quiet exchange with Officer Perez. They were no longer looking towards Amara as a situation to be handled, but rather as a point of reference. Officer Daniels approached Amara. "Miss Lewis," he said, "I want to be clear that we're taking this seriously." Amara nodded. "I know," she replied, "and I appreciate that. There will be a report," he continued, "and there will be follow-up." Amara looked at him. "I hope so," she said, "because this didn't start with me, and it won't end with me either." He nodded this time without hesitation. Further away, Richard and Elaine Whitman sat silently in their seats. Elaine gazed out the window, her face tense. Richard bowed his head, his hand to his forehead. No one spoke to them. No one attacked them. But the silence directed at them now was very different from the silence that had been directed at Amara earlier. Amara didn't look at them for long. She didn't need revenge. What she wanted was awareness. And it seemed that was spreading slowly, but surely. She opened her notebook and added a few more lines, not about anyone's mistakes, but about the reactions, the whispers, the glances, the stories that had just been shared. She knew that after this flight, there would be meetings, reports, and decisions. But the most important thing for her had already happened. Humans had begun to speak. It wasn't because she was the CEO. It was because she stood firm when they thought they had to sit down. Amara leaned her head gently against the back of the chair, closing her eyes for a few seconds. She felt tired, but it was a pleasant kind of tiredness. The tiredness of having done what needed to be done. The loudspeaker announced that in-flight service would resume as normal. A short, neutral announcement, as if nothing unusual had just happened. Amara opened her eyes and looked out the window. The sky stretched endlessly. The plane continued moving forward. But inside this first-class cabin something changed. Not loudly, not formally, but enough to leave a lasting impression on those present. And Amara knew this was just the beginning. After the initial wave of reactions, the first-class cabin gradually returned to normal. Drink trays were brought out. Some passengers put on headphones. Others opened books or laptops, as if the flight had returned to a state of normalcy. But Amara Lewis knew very well that things were never the same again. She opened her notebook, flipping through the pages she had filled out since the beginning of the flight. Time, name, words. Each line was concise, precise, emotionless, judgmental. Just facts. She had learned long ago that when the truth is carefully documented, it carries more weight than any accusation. A figure stopped next to seat 1A. Officer Daniels stood there, holding a thin stack of papers. "Miss Lewis," he said, his voice low and intimate, "this is a preliminary incident summary." Amara took it, glancing at it quickly. "Thank you," she said. "I'll review it later." He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "There's something else you should know." Amara looked up. "I'm listening." Officer Daniels lowered his voice further. "This isn't the first time we've been called for something like this on this route." Amara didn't seem surprised. "How often?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "Often enough that it's familiar." The word echoed in Amara's mind. Familiar. What is familiar is often what has been normalized. "Do the reports usually look like this?" Amara asked, pointing lightly at the stack of papers. Officer Daniels nodded. "Usually, they end with the passenger complying." Amara nodded slightly. "And when they don't," he was silent for a long moment. "Then they tend to get complicated." Amara understood very well the meaning of the word complicated in this context. It often meant that the story was written in a way that was unfavorable to the less powerful person. She thanked Officer Daniels, then set the papers aside. Her gaze swept across the cabin. Everyone was doing their normal things. But now Amara saw layers beneath the surface. In the galley ahead, Emily Carter stood speaking softly to another flight attendant. Her shoulders slumped slightly, no longer maintaining the straight posture she had previously held. Emily's face reflected something closer to confusion than fear. A moment later, Emily slowly walked towards Amara. She stopped at a distance that was just right, neither intrusive nor evasive. "Miss Lewis," Emily said, her voice hoarser than before. "May I speak with you?" Amara nodded. "Go ahead." Emily swallowed. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "About intent, not erasing impact." Amara remained silent, letting Emily continue. "I've worked this route for 3 years," Emily said, "and I thought I was being fair. I really did." Amara looked at her. "What made you think that?" she asked. Emily hesitated. "I followed procedures," she replied. "And I did what I was taught would keep things running smoothly." "Smoothly for whom?" Amara asked, her voice not harsh. Emily was silent. Then she sighed, as if she had just realized something. "For the people who complain the loudest," she said softly. Amara nodded. "That's often how bias hides," she said. "Behind efficiency." Emily looked down at the floor. "I didn't see it until today." Amara didn't comfort her. But she didn't attack either. "Seeing it is the first step," Amara said. "What you do after that matters more." Emily nodded, her eyes red and teary. "I'm willing to be part of fixing this," she said. Amara stared at her for a long time, long enough for Emily to avert her gaze. "Then be honest in your report," Amara said. "Not just about what happened. About why it happened." Emily took a deep breath. "I will." She turned away, her steps slower but more steady. In the back of the compartment, Lena Brooks was arranging trays of drinks. The young woman glanced at Amara, then quickly returned to her work, but her eyes were full of thought. Amara wondered how many people within this system had witnessed similar things but lacked the opportunity or safety to speak out. She opened her phone not to call someone, but to review an internal memo she had read months ago. A summary of complaints presented concisely and neutrally. No mention of discrimination. Only customer dissatisfaction. At that time, Amara had marked it for later consideration. Later. Always later. She turned off the screen, feeling a slight heaviness in her chest. Not guilt but realization that her power lay not only in major decisions but also in the small overlooked details. Another passenger approached. It was the middle-aged woman who had spoken to Amara earlier. "I hope you don't mind," she said, "but I want to tell you another story." Amara nodded. "Last year on a flight," she said, "I witnessed a black man being asked to change seats because another family wanted to sit together." Amara listened. "He agreed," she continued. "Nobody said anything. We all thought that was it." She paused, her voice lowering. "But today I realized that perhaps for him it never really ended." Amara placed her hand very gently on the old woman's hand. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Those stories often go unrecorded." The woman nodded, returned to her seat, leaving Amara with even heavier thoughts. She leaned back in her seat, gazing up at the cabin ceiling. The reading lamp cast a small, steady circle of light. She thought about the company she led. Tens of thousands of employees. Millions of passengers each year. Countless small moments that occurred each day, most of which never reached the CEO's desk. Until one of those moments happened to her. Amara understood that this wasn't a story about her being treated unfairly. That was just the point of contention. The real story was about a system that had learned to deal with inconvenience by shifting the burden onto the most vulnerable. She placed her hand on the notebook and added another line. "This didn't start with me." Then another line. "And it won't end with me." The loudspeaker blared, announcing the current altitude and estimated landing time. It was a very ordinary announcement, but Amara heard it with a different feeling. She knew that after this flight, there would be unpleasant meetings, difficult questions, defensive reactions. But she also knew that if she did nothing, everything would go back to how it was before. Amara doesn't want that. She didn't want the truth, which had just been revealed, to be shut down again for the sake of convenience. She inhaled and exhaled slowly. Power, she thought, wasn't about avoiding difficult situations. It was about being willing to face them. After her conversation with Emily Carter ended, Amara Lewis did nothing for several minutes. She didn't make a phone call. She didn't send an email. She didn't take a flurry of notes. She just sat still, letting what had just happened settle down in its own rhythm. Amara learned one important lesson throughout her years of leadership. Not every decision needs to be made immediately. Some decisions require a period of careful consideration. She glanced around the first-class cabin once more. Everyone had returned to their own worlds, but not entirely as before. There was a newfound caution in the way they looked at each other. It was as if they had just realized that seemingly small things could carry far greater significance. Amara opened her phone not to contact the office, but to jot down a few brief thoughts. Not orders. Not detailed plans. Just questions. Who has asked for help the most? What are those requests based on? And who decides they are reasonable? She knew that if these questions weren't asked, things like today would continue to happen, perhaps not to her but to others who had no other choice. An elderly flight attendant approached. Amara recognized her. She had served on this flight from the beginning, but had hardly been involved in the situation beforehand. "Miss Lewis," she said, her voice low and slow. "I've been with the airline for 22 years. Amara looked up. "That's a long time," she said. She smiled slightly. "Yes. Long enough to see patterns." Amara said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "There are things we do because that's how it's always been done," she said. "And sometimes we stop asking whether they're right." Amara nodded. "That's how systems protect themselves," she said. The elderly flight attendant looked at Amara with a mixture of respect and relief. "I'm glad it was you today," she said. Amara was slightly surprised. "Why?" she asked. "Because you didn't turn it into a scene," she replied. "You turned it into a mirror." That remark stayed with Amara longer than the flight attendant stayed with her. As she turned away, Amara wondered how many people within this system had seen the problem long ago but never had the chance to name it. She took out her headphones, but didn't turn on any music. She left them lying on the folding table as a sign that she was still present and still ready to listen. A short while later, Officer Daniels returned. "Miss Lewis," he said, "I wanted to let you know we've flagged this incident for internal review." Amara nodded. "That's a start," she said. "There may be questions," he continued. "From our side, from the airline." Amara looked at him. "I welcome them," she replied. "Questions are better than assumptions." He nodded, his expression relieved. "I think today will change how some of us approach our jobs." Amara wasn't sure that would be true for everyone, but she knew that just a few people changing was enough to create movement. She looked out the window. The sun was setting its light, entering the cabin at a different angle. Time passed, bringing with it the feeling that they were getting closer to their destination, not just geographically. Amara thought about the upcoming board meeting, about the numbers, the strategies, the growth targets. They all mattered. But today, something else had taken a place on her priority list. Fairness is not a media campaign. It's a way of operating. She opened the notebook and wrote a few more lines, this time being more specific. Review, seat change protocols, language used in reports, training discretion versus bias. She didn't write discipline. She didn't write punishment. Not because she was avoiding responsibility, but because she understood that lasting change rarely begins with fear. At the back of the compartment, Lena Brooks walked past. She paused very quietly. "Miss Lewis," Lena said softly, "I've been thinking." Amara smiled. "That's usually a good sign," she said. "I realized," Lena continued, "that I've been taught to keep things calm at all costs." Amara nodded. "And what did calm mean today?" she asked. Lena hesitated. "It meant asking the same person to bend," she said. "Because it was easier." Amara looked at the young woman, her gaze softening. "Ease is not a neutral value," she said. "It always chooses a side." Lena took a deep breath, as if she had just realized something very important. "I don't want to be blind to that anymore," she said. Amara placed her hand on the folding table. "Then, don't be," she replied. "And when you feel pressure to choose ease over fairness, pause." Lena nodded. "I will." As Lena left, Amara felt a very familiar sensation, cautious hope, not explosive, not blindly optimistic, but enough to believe that today was more than just a personal moment. The loudspeaker announced that preparations for landing were about an hour away. The crew walked through the cabin, checking everything gently without any rush. Emily Carter didn't turn to speak to Amara. But Amara noticed that every time Emily walked past, she kept her gaze at eye level, neither avoiding her eyes nor lowering her head. A small change. But Amara saw it. She wondered if Emily was questioning herself, and she knew that was more important than any public apology. Amara closed the notebook and put it in her bag. She didn't need to write anything more now. What she needed to remember was already in her. She thought about her mother, about the advice she'd received long ago. "You don't need to make a big deal out of it. You just need to do the right thing." Amara smiled very slightly. Today she did the right thing, not because she's the CEO, but because she's a person who refuses to be pushed out of her position just to make others feel better. And she knew that when the plane landed, this story wouldn't end in first class. It would follow her out the plane's door, into the meeting rooms, into those seemingly technical dry decisions. But from now on, those decisions will carry the memory of a 1A seat. The plane began to descend very slowly. There was no sensation of falling, just a slight movement, enough for those with keen senses to realize they were approaching the ground. Amara Lewis felt it through the very subtle pressure in her ears, through the changing colors of the light outside the window. She remained seated in seat 1, a relaxed but not giving up. The most tense moment was over, but Amara knew that what followed was often far more complicated. Her phone vibrated gently. One message, then another. Amara didn't open it immediately. She left the phone lying still on the folding table, as if to make sure she wasn't reacting instinctively. She'd learned that a long time ago, a quick reaction isn't always the right one. When she picked up her phone, a message from Marcus Hill, her chief of staff, appeared on the screen. "We're seeing chat. Internal first. Not public yet." Amara closed her eyes for a brief second. "It happened faster than I thought," she thought to herself. She typed her reply word by word. "Do not issue statements. Collect facts. Full timeline." The message was sent. No exclamation points. No harsh instructions. But for Marcus, that was enough. He knew her style very well. Another message arrived this time from Naomi Price, head of Human Resources. Amara, are you okay? That simple question made Amara pause longer. Not because she wasn't okay, but because few people ask a CEO that question in a professional context. She replied, I am. We'll talk when I land. She locked the screen and put the phone down. Amara looked out the window. The city below began to take shape, blocks of buildings, streets, streams of cars, gradually becoming clearer. The world went on steadily, unaware that high above, in an airplane cabin, a link in the chain had been broken. At the front of the cabin, Emily Carter was speaking softly to the chief flight attendant. Their voices were low enough that no one else could hear, but Amara saw the way Emily nodded repeatedly, the way her shoulders hunched slightly as if she were withdrawing into herself. Emily was no longer in control of the situation, and Amara realized that this forced her to confront herself. A moment later, the chief flight attendant approached Amara. Miss Lewis, she said calmly, I wanted to personally apologize for the experience you had today. Amara looked at her. Thank you, she said, but I'm more interested in what happens next. The chief flight attendant nodded. There will be a review, she said, and changes if warranted. If warranted, Amara repeated, not sarcastically, but emphatically. I hope the review looks beyond procedure. The chief flight attendant looked at Amara, her gaze more serious. It will, she said. This incident has visibility. Amara understood. Visibility. When a story is no longer easily overlooked. The chief flight attendant turned away, leaving Amara with a clear thought. Change in large systems rarely begins for the sake of morality. It usually begins for the sake of light. In the back seat, Lena Brooks was helping a passenger tidy up a tray table. The young woman's movements were slow and careful. As she passed Amara, Lena paused for a split second. Miss Lewis, Lena said very softly, people are talking. Amara nodded. They always do, she said. What matters is what they talk about. Lena smiled faintly. They're talking about fairness, she said, not the seat. Amara looked at Lena, a warm feeling welling up inside her. Then something has already shifted, she replied. The loudspeaker announced the preparation for landing. The crew began a final check. Seats were upright. Foldable tables were locked. Everything proceeded according to familiar procedure in an almost reassuringly orderly manner. But Amara knew that outside this airplane cabin the process wasn't so simple. Her phone rang again. An internal email was forwarded with a concise subject line, Seat Reassignment Protocol. Clarification needed. Amara didn't open her mouth. She smiled very slightly. Clarification. A neutral word, yet it holds the power to open many doors. The plane touched down. The touch was smooth without any strong jolts. The engine sounds changed. Some passengers clapped habitually. Others breathed a sigh of relief. Amara also breathed a sigh of relief, but not because the flight was over, rather because another phase was about to begin. As the plane taxied to the gate, the seatbelt sign went off. Passengers began to stand up and retrieve their luggage. The atmosphere became more bustling, as if everyone wanted to quickly leave this space that had witnessed so much. Amara was the last to stand up. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't push her way through the crowd. She picked up her handbag, put on her coat, and stood tall, as she always did. As she stepped out into the hallway, Emily Carter was standing there. Emily looked at Amara, taking a deep breath. Miss Lewis, she said, her voice slightly trembling, but clear. I want you to know, I've already written my report. Amara nodded, and she asked, I didn't make it sound easier than it was, Emily said. I didn't soften anything. Amara looked at Emily for a long time. That's a good place to start, she said. Emily swallowed. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, but I do want to do better. Amara nodded, then said slowly, doing better doesn't start with expecting grace, she said. It starts with accountability. Emily nodded. I understand. Amara continued walking without saying anything more. Not because she was cold, but because not every conversation needs to be prolonged. Officer Daniels was waiting at the airplane door. Miss Lewis, he said, there will be follow-up from our department. I expect that, Amara replied, and I'll make myself available. He nodded, his eyes showing a mixture of respect and thoughtfulness. For what it's worth, he said, you handled this with restraint. Amara smiled very slightly. Restraint is often mistaken for weakness, she said. But it's not. She stepped off the plane. The air of the airport rushed in vast and noisy, the sound of luggage wheels, the announcements over the loudspeaker, the hurried footsteps, the world goes on. Marcus Hill stood waiting at the end of the jet bridge. He looked at Amara, his eyes a mixture of anxiety and relief. "We have a car," he said, "and a lot to talk about." Amara nodded. "Yes," she said, "but not everything needs to happen tonight." Marcus smiled. "I figured you'd say that." They walked side by side, not saying much. Amara sensed the weight of the day, gradually settling, giving way to something else, a clearer determination. She knew the emails would come, the calls, the conflicting opinions. Some would support her, some would be defensive, some would say she was overreacting. But Amara also knew one thing for sure. Once the truth has been revealed, it's not easily pushed back into the shadows. She stepped out of the airport, the last rays of sunlight illuminating her face. She took a deep breath, savoring the cool air. Seat 1A is behind us. But its story is not. The car rolled out of San Francisco Airport in the late afternoon light. The glass buildings reflected the fading sunlight, creating dappled patches of light on the car windows. Amara Lewis sat in the back seat, leaning back, her eyes looking out the window, but her mind wandered far beyond the road ahead. Marcus Hill sat in the front, deliberately silent. He knew Amara well enough to understand that this wasn't the time to fill the space with words. Amara's phone rang again. It's no longer an internal message. A link. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. "Someone posted," he said. "Not mainstream yet, but it's moving." Amara didn't open the link right away. She asked, her voice calm, "Facts or speculation?" "A mix," Marcus replied. "No names, but enough details." Amara nodded slightly. "That was inevitable," she said. "The question is what we do next." Marcus took a deep breath. "Legal will advise silence," he said. "Comms will want control." Amara smiled faintly. "They always do." The car stopped at a red light. A pedestrian crossed the street, holding a paper coffee cup, completely unaware that inside this car, a decision that could affect thousands of people was being considered. Amara opened her phone. A short post written by an anonymous passenger. No anger, no dramatization. Just a chilling description of a black woman being asked to give up her VIP seat and how that situation escalated until her identity was revealed. There were no direct accusations, no hashtags, but there was something far more dangerous: trust. Amara locks the screen. "They'll ask why you didn't say anything," Marcus said. "And they'll also ask why you did." Amara nodded. "I know," she replied. "That's always the trade-off." The car continued to move. The city flashed by like a silent film. Amara recalls many moments in her career. Times when she chose silence for the greater good, times when she spoke out and paid the price. She doesn't naively believe that transparency is always appreciated. But she also no longer believes that silence always protects anyone. When the car stopped in front of the hotel, Marcus turned around. "Board members are already texting," he said. Mixed reactions. Amara nodded. "Set up a call," she said. "But not tonight." Marcus was slightly surprised. "Tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow," Amara replied. "People need time to react." "Including me." Marcus smiled very slightly. "Understood." In the hotel room, Amara put down her bag, took off her coat, and stood still for a moment in the quiet space. She could hear the distant sounds of traffic and the very soft hum of the air conditioner. A feeling of weariness spread through her, but it wasn't overwhelming. The phone vibrates. This time, it's Naomi Price. "Amara." Naomi said, her voice low. "It's starting to circulate internally." "Good," Amara replied. Naomi paused for a moment. "That's not what most CEOs would say." Amara sat down in the armchair. "Most CEOs don't get mistaken for someone expendable," she said. "And if we only address things when they're clean, we'll never address the real ones." Naomi sighed. "HR is nervous." "They should be," Amara said. "But they should also be curious." Naomi chuckled softly, though a little nervously. "So what's your instinct?" she asked. Amara looked up at the ceiling. "My instinct," she said slowly, "is to speak, but not reactively." Naomi was silent for a moment, then said, "That's risky." Amara nodded. "So, is pretending this didn't happen." The call ended. Amara put down the phone, stood up, and walked towards the window. The city of San Francisco stretched out below, vibrant, complex, never truly asleep. She thought about the people who had been on that flight. About Lena Brooks beginning to see her job through a different lens. About Emily Carter having to write an honest report that might shake her understanding of herself. About the passengers who had given in silently. She also thought about the people who would read that post. People who would nod and say, "That sounds familiar." Amara sat down at her desk and opened her laptop, not to write a press release, but to write for herself. A draft, no logo, no title. She knocked. I didn't plan to tell this story, but it happened. And what matters is not that it happened to me. It's that it happens to others all the time. She paused, deleted a line, rewrote it. Amara knew that if she spoke, the story would no longer belong to her. It would be analyzed, dissected, and distorted. Some would call her brave. Some would say she was exploiting her position. Some would ask why she didn't handle it internally. But she also knew something else. If she doesn't speak up, someone else will be asked to stand up from their seat. The phone vibrated again. A message from Marcus Hill. Media inquiry just came in. Anonymous source. Asking for comment. Amara stared at the screen for a long time. She thought of seat 1A. She thought of the feeling of being asked to leave for someone else's convenience. She thought of the moment she decided not to stand up. She typed a reply. Acknowledge receipt. No comment yet. Then she added another line after a few seconds. But schedule a window tomorrow. I want to say something. On my terms. Marcus replied almost immediately. Understood. Amara closed her laptop. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a few seconds. Not to escape, but to confirm to herself that she was ready. Tomorrow this story might make headlines. Or it might be overshadowed by other news. She couldn't control that, but she was able to control how she appeared in it. Amara opened her eyes, her gaze more steady. Silence may be safe, but the truth when spoken correctly creates the space for change. And she knew she wouldn't choose the safe option this time. The morning in San Francisco began with a thin layer of mist settling over the tall buildings. Sunlight streamed through the hotel room window, gently falling on the desk where Amara Lewis sat. She had woken up very early without an alarm clock. Some days her body instinctively knew that today wasn't an ordinary day. The laptop opened in front of her. On the screen was the draft she had written the night before. Not long, not eloquent, just slow, carefully considered words. Amara read it again. It wasn't to correct the grammar. It was to check something more important, whether each sentence was true to her feelings and values. The phone vibrates. Marcus Hill called. Good morning, he said, his voice alert but slightly tense. Are you ready? Amara looked out the window for another second. Yes, she replied, but let's be clear about what this is. Marcus remained silent, waiting for her to continue. I'm not making a statement to defend myself, Amara said. And I'm not apologizing for existing in my seat. Marcus let out a soft sigh, as if relieved. Understood. This is about naming a pattern, Amara continued, and taking responsibility for a system that allows it. Marcus nodded, though Amara couldn't see. That will make some people uncomfortable. It should, Amara said. Comfort has been unevenly distributed for a long time. The call is over. Marcus will handle the rest. Schedule appointments. Coordinate communications. Prepare for the inevitable reactions. Amara stood up, put on her blazer, and adjusted her collar. She looked at herself in the mirror, not to check her appearance, but to confirm her presence. She didn't see a CEO. She saw a woman who had decided not to step aside anymore. The press conference wasn't big. No stage. No fancy backdrop. Just a brightly lit meeting room, a few cameras, and a select group of journalists. Not to control the narrative, but to get it started the right way. Amara walked into the room. All eyes turned to her. There was curiosity. There was expectation, and also skepticism. She sat down, not in a hurry, not avoiding anything. Thank you for being here. Amara began, her voice low and clear. I'm here because something happened on one of our flights. She paused, to let the room quiet down. I could talk about titles, she continued. But that's not the point. Some pens stopped midway. What matters, Amara said, is that I was asked to give up my seat because it was convenient for others. And when I didn't, the situation escalated. She didn't say racist. She didn't assign blame. She told the truth. And the reason I'm speaking today, she said, is not because it happened to me. She looked directly into the camera. It's because it happens to people who don't have the option to reveal a title. The atmosphere in the room changed noticeably. Those present understood that this was no longer a personal matter. Amara continued, her voice steady. As CEO, I'm responsible not only for our profits but for how power moves through our company. A journalist raised their hand. Miss Lewis, some critics say this should have been handled internally. Amara nodded. And it will be, she said. But internal handling should not mean internal silence. Another person asked, are there consequences for the staff involved? Amara replied immediately. There will be accountability, she said, but not scapegoating. She paused, then clarified. If we punish individuals without fixing the system, we guarantee the same outcome next time. The answer didn't please everyone. Amara knew that. But she also knew that leadership isn't about pleasing everyone. Another question arose, more direct. Miss Lewis, do you believe race played a role? Amara took a deep breath. She didn't flinch. I believe assumes played a role, she said. And assumptions are not neutral. She didn't argue. She defined it. When we keep asking the same type of people to help, it's no longer a coincidence, Amara continued. That's a pattern. The room was silent. Amara ended with something no one asked, but she knew she needed to say. We are reviewing our protocols, she said. Our language, our training, and our understanding of what fairness actually looks like in practice. She stood up. This is not the end of a story, she said. It's the beginning of a responsibility. The meeting is over. No applause. Not necessary. As soon as Amara stepped out of the room, her phone started ringing incessantly. Text messages, emails, missed calls. Marcus walked beside her, glancing quickly at the screen. It's everywhere, he said. Headlines are coming in. Amara nodded. Let them come, she said. They got back into the car. The city continued to move, but somewhere a conversation had begun. In the airline's office, Naomi Price was in an urgent meeting with the HR team. Slides were on display. The familiar words suddenly seemed insufficient. At another airport, Lena Brooks was preparing for her next flight. She overheard two flight attendants talking about the press conference. Lena didn't interrupt, but she stood straighter. In a suburban home, a woman watched the news, nodding slightly. Finally, she whispered. Not everyone was supportive. There were critical comments. There were angry emails. There were people saying Amara was making a big deal out of it. She read a few of them. Then she stopped. Amara didn't need everyone's approval. She needed a conversation that couldn't be ignored. That evening, when things had calmed down, Amara sat alone in her hotel room. She opened her little notebook, the one that had been with her throughout the flight. She wrote one last line for today. Visibility is not the goal. Change is. She put down her pen. She felt tired, but it was a meaningful kind of tiredness. Tomorrow, the real work will begin. Policies, meetings, slow but necessary changes. Amara knew that speaking up was the easier part. The hard part was sticking with the truth to the end, but she also knew she wouldn't go back to silence. Not anymore. A week after the press conference, Amara Lewis stood by her office window looking down at the slow-moving traffic below. The city in the morning had a familiar look, busy, somewhat indifferent, always moving forward. Life doesn't stop because of a story, even if that story has generated a lot of buzz. Amara took a sip of her now-cooled coffee, then set the cup down on the table. Neatly arranged documents lay on the table, internal reports, proposals for process adjustments, and a new training schedule. No sensational headlines. No flowery language. Just work. And Amara knew that it was here in the small, repetitive things, the things that nobody applauded, that real change had a chance to exist. Marcus Hill knocked and entered. Board reviewed the first draft, he said. Some pushback. But no one walked away. Amara nodded. That's progress, she replied. Marcus smiled. They're asking better questions now. Amara turned to look at him. Good, she said. Questions mean they're listening. Marcus placed a file on the table. Training pilots and cabin crew will take time, he said. And patience. Amara opened the file and quickly scanned it. Time we have, she said. Patience we'll practice. When Marcus left, Amara sat down and opened the small notebook that had accompanied her on that flight. She turned to the last page, where the first entries had been written in first class. Questions, notes, incomplete thoughts. She reread it not for nostalgia, but to measure the distance between the woman who sat in seat 1A that day and the woman sitting here now. She didn't see herself changing too much, just more distinctly. The phone vibrated. A short email from Lena Brooks. Miss Lewis, I just wanted to say, yesterday, I spoke up when a request didn't feel right. It wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. Amara read the email twice. She smiled very slightly. Then she replied, "It did matter. Thank you for noticing." She put the phone down, feeling a warm sensation spread through her. Not victory, not pride. Rather, a cautious reassurance, that feeling you get when you know that at least something is in place. That afternoon, Amara left the office earlier than usual. She wanted to walk. She wanted the city to touch her in the simplest way possible. On the sidewalk, strangers passed each other, each carrying their own story. No one knew who she was, and Amara liked that. She stopped at a small bookstore, flipped through a few pages, stand still, listening to the gentle ringing of the doorbell as people entered and exited. An ordinary moment, yet fulfilling. On the way home, Amara thought of Emily Carter. Emily's report had been submitted honest and straightforward. Emily hadn't received a harsh disciplinary action, but she had been asked to join a process review team, confronting what she had once considered normal. Amara knew it wouldn't be an easy path, but learning to look at oneself has never been easy. She also thought of Richard and Elaine Whitman. There was no public apology, no dramatic scene of remorse, just a short private email from Richard admitting that he hadn't thought it through enough. Not a perfect ending, but an honest beginning. That evening, Amara opened a drawer and took out an old envelope. Inside was the boarding pass for the Atlanta-San Francisco Flight 1A. She kept it not for sentimental reasons, but for the memory of the feeling of being asked to leave where you belong simply because it was more convenient for someone else. She placed the card on the table and gazed at it for a long time. Amara recalled a question many people had asked her after the press conference. If you weren't the CEO, what would happen? She responded in various ways. But deep down, she knew the simplest answer: it had happened to many people, and it was still happening. The only difference that day was that she didn't get up. It wasn't because she wanted to prove anything. Rather, it was because she understood that every time we stand up to make way for injustice, we teach the system that this is how it should operate. Amara opened the balcony door. A gentle evening breeze blew, carrying the scent of the city. The lights in the distance twinkled like tiny points of hope, not dazzling but persistent. She thought about the people who had texted her, the stories that had been sent, old memories that had been brought to light. Not all of them needed a response, but all of them needed to be acknowledged. Before going to bed, Amara wrote one last line in her notebook. "You don't need permission to stay in your seat. You already belong there." She closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf. Tomorrow, she would have another meeting. More signings, more debates. A CEO's job doesn't change because of a story, but the way she did it had changed. Amara turned off the lights. A gentle darkness enveloped the room. She lay down, savoring the rare stillness. In my sleep, images of the airplane cabin appear. Soft lighting, the steady hum of the engines, and seat 1A no longer the focal point of tension, but a silent symbol. The symbol of being in your place. No asking permission, no apologies, simply being there. And somewhere on another flight, someone might remember this story. When asked, "Would you be willing to help?" they'll pause for a moment. They'll wonder, who am I helping? And why always myself? If that moment of pause ever happens, even just once, Amara knows that the story of seat 1A has accomplished what it needed to. Not noisy, not perfect, but enough to open up a new space. A place where people are allowed to be in their rightful place. This story isn't about victory. It's about dignity. Throughout our lives, many of us have become accustomed to giving up our seats. We give up for the sake of harmony. We give up because we don't want trouble. We give up because we think it's just a small matter. But the danger is when we give in. Too often, injustice begins to be seen as normal. The woman in the story didn't speak up because she was the CEO. She spoke up because if even she stood up, then those without titles or power would forever be the ones forced to step aside. The biggest lesson here is holding on to your position isn't selfish. It's a quiet way of saying I deserve it too. We don't need to argue. We don't need to make a big deal out of it. We just need to avoid shrinking ourselves so that others feel more comfortable. And sometimes just one person daring to stay is enough to make the entire system stop and think. If this story reminds you of a moment in your life, a time when you remained silent even though you were hurting inside, then know this: you are not wrong to want to be treated fairly. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story to the end. If you see yourself in any of what you've just heard, please like, share the video with your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel to continue following more gentle, profound, and very human stories. Stay here, because you deserve a place.